The steel floor beneath my boots didn't just vibrate. It hummed with the kind of low, industrial dread that makes your teeth ache. 5 minutes ago, every terminal on Sector 4 flashed crimson, a single word overriding the diagnostic screens: lockdown. Then the heavy pneumatic blast doors dropped like guillotine blades, sealing the central atrium and trapping 45 frantic, screaming young women inside a floating military cot. With a guy whose only real weapon was a heavy-duty wrench and a habit of overthinking. They didn't know the shore was gone. They didn't know the automated lifeboats had just purged their fuel tanks into the Pacific. And they certainly didn't know that the ocean outsea had swallowed the world whole. All they knew was that the lights had turned emergency red. The air conditioning was dying, and I was the only uniform in sight who wasn't currently sobbing or kicking the reinforcement. Ed Glass. Step back from the console before you fry the backup regulators, I said, my voice cutting through the rising hysteria as I grabbed a fierce, athletic girl by the shoulder of her tactical vest. She spun around instantly, her hand dropping toward an empty sidearm holster, her sharp jaw locked in a mix of military discipline and pure survival panic. This was Vance, a junior security officer who looked like she was used to giving orders, not taking them from a grease-stained maintenance tech. The primary relays are dead, Lieutenant. If you keep hammering that override switch, you'll trigger the fire suppression halon gas, and we'll all suffocate in exactly 4 minutes. Vance glared at me, her chest heaving as 44 other pairs of eyes suddenly locked onto us, tracking the argument like it was a lifeline. This is a level 5 security breach. Tech, she hissed, lowering her voice so the terrified crowd of civilian interns, medical students, and stranded researchers wouldn't catch her. Desperation. My radio is completely dead. The external array isn't responding. Tell me you have a master key for these pneumatic seals, or I will use an explosive charge on Sector 3. I wiped a streak of hydraulic fluid from my forehead, looking past her at the sea of pale, trembling faces gathered near the central structural pillar. There was Chloe, a quiet girl in a torn lab coat, already ripping up clean linens to hand out to a hyperventilating student, her hands steady despite the chaos. Farther back, sitting completely still on a supply crate with her knees pulled tightly to her chest, was a girl with striking, completely blank eyes who didn't belong on any crew amethyst I'd processed this morning. Rin. The sheer variety of personalities in this room was a powder keg waiting for a match, and right now, Vance was holding the lighter. An explosive charge will just trigger the hull integrity sensors, which means the main computer will flood this entire compartment to save the rest of the fortress, I explained calmly, tapping the digital diagnostic pad on my wrist. Thanks to a strange, hyper-focused intuition I'd kept hidden since my academy days, the chaotic mess of circuitry behind the steel bulkhead made perfect sense to me. I could practically feel the power flowing and dying through the metal veins of the ship. The automated system thinks we're under attack from the outside. It's not trying to keep us in. It's trying to stop whatever is out there from getting to the core. We aren't getting out, and nobody is coming to unlock these doors from the mainland. A sharp gasp rippled through the front row of girls as my words sank in, the reality of their situation crashing down heavier than the steel walls around them. Vance stepped closer, her breath smelling slightly of mint and stale coffee, her fingers digging into the fabric of my collar as she forced me against the terminal frame. "Don't you dare start a mutiny before we even know what's happening," she whispered, her eyes burning with a dangerous mixture of authority and absolute terror. "You don't tell them that. You tell them the military is on the way. You tell them we have an emergency protocol." Lying to them burns oxygen, Vance, and right now, our life support systems are operating on a closed loop that's already dropping by 0.5% every 10 minutes, I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh, steady whisper as I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my shirt. "Look around you. We have 2 crates of standard rations, 3 functional water filtration units, and 45 civilians who are about to realize that this floating fortress is currently a floaty NG coffin. If you want to play commander, go ahead and organize them into rationing shifts, but leave the machinery to someone who actually knows how to keep the heart of this monster beating." She opened her mouth to argue, but the words were instantly swallowed by a deep, metallic groan that shuddered through the very deck plates beneath our feet. Somewhere deep in the belly of the fortress, in the flooded lower maintenance bays where the automated defense grids were housed, something massive had just shifted. The emergency red lighting flickered violently, dying out for 3 agonizing seconds before snapping back on with an ominous, low-frequency screech from the PA system. I looked down at my diagnostic pad, my heart stopping as a cascade of fatal error codes began scrolling across the small screen in rapid succession. I thought the lockdown was the worst thing that could happen to us today, but looking at the secondary power grid collapsing in real time, I realized the real nightmare was just waking up. The system error logs didn't just crawl across my wrist terminal. They cascaded in a waterfall of bleeding crimson data that smelled metaphorically of burnt silicone and catastrophic structural failure. Deep inside the fortress's lower wet docks, automated defense grid 7B had gone completely haywire, its logic processors misinterpreting the lockdown protocol as a hostile, aborting action by foreign combatants. The groan of the metal beneath us deepened, a low, tectonic screech that vibrated up through my marrow as the primary hydraulic pumps threw their gears in a desperate, machine-bright, net attempt to isolate a non-existent threat. 45 girls stared at me, their breathing shallow and rhythmic in the red-tinted twilight of the atrium, waiting for the one guy with grease under his fingernails to tell them the ceiling wasn't about to collapse into the sea. I could see Chloe toward the rear, her fingers buried in the fabric of her medical kit, her wide eyes locked onto my hands to see if they were shaking. They weren't, but only because my fingers were too stiff from cold hydraulic fluid to register the adrenaline spike. Vance didn't look at the crowd. She looked at my face, her tactical instincts picking up on the sudden, rigid shift in my posture before I could even mask it with a technician's professional indifference. Blake, give me a status report that doesn't include the word coffin or suffocate if you want to keep your teeth, she muttered under her breath, her hand rising to grip the high LT of her standard-issue combat knife since her sidearm was still locked in the armory 2 decks below. The hull is double-reinforced titanium steel composite. It shouldn't be making that sound unless we've struck an reef or a subsurface mine. It's not an external impact, Vance, I said, my voice dropping into that flat, clipped cadence I used whenever an engine block was about to throw a piston through a bulkhead. The main computer just isolated Sector 4 lower ballast tanks and started a high-pressure purge against the automated security bulkheads. The pressure differential between this room and the subdeck is currently climbing past 300 atmospheres because the drainage valves are frozen shut by the emergency seal. If that lower seal fails, the air in this room won't just thin out, the floor is going to buckle upward and turn this entire atrium into a pneumatic meat grinder. A ripple of motion stirred the crowd behind her as 2 of the younger civilian research assistants stepped forward, their faces pasty under the strobing crimson emergency lights. Air voices overlapping in a high-pitched flurry of demands for answers, for internet access, for an escape route that didn't exist. Vance spun on her heel, her posture instantly hardening into the rigid, uncompromising silhouette of a military officer who had spent her entire youth learning how to suppress riots in high-risk zones. Back to your designated sectors now, she barked, her voice striking the steel walls like a whip crack, successfully halting the girls in their tracks, but doing absolutely nothing. To clear the thick, heavy scent of terror rising from the collective crowd. The maintenance team is executing a standard systems reset. Anyone who interferes with the console perimeters will be detained under Article 9 of the Fortress Security Act. It was a beautiful lie, standard textbook protocol designed for a world that had vanished into the gray Pacific 5 hours ago. But it bought me exactly 90 seconds of silence. Sink my thoughts into the machine's anatomy. My hidden talent wasn't magic. It was an innate, architectural understanding of how physical systems connected, an intuitive map that let me see the flow of current through a copper wire just by listening to the specific frequency of its hum. Right now, that hum was wrong. It was jagged, or rhythmic, and interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic thud from the ventilation shaft directly beneath the main command platform W. Here we stood. Someone, or something, was manually overriding the subdeck relays from inside the unmapped crawlspaces near the keel. Vance, Get 3 of your strongest girls and move those heavy equipment crates over the central drainage crate in the western corner, I commanded, not caring that I was shattering her chain of command in front of her subordinates as I pulled a heavy, modified plasma cutter from my tool belt. Don't ask questions, just do it. The backup pneumatic lines are venting into the drainage pipes, and if that grate pops, it's going to launch 20 pounds of cast iron through me own skull. She hesitated for a single, dangerous second, her eye searching mine for any sign of deception or panic before she realized that the floor beneath her boots had just grown perceptibly warmer to the touch. "Chloe, Martinez, come with me, now," she shouted, her training taking over as she lunged toward the nearest logistics container, her boots slipping slightly on the condensation forming on the steel deck. The girls moved with a desperate, uncoordinated speed, their collective strength barely enough to slide the 300-pound metal box across the slick floor, the sound of grinding aluminum screaming against the low-frequency drone of the dying fortress. I ignored them, dropping to my knees beside the main junction terminal and tearing the protective casing off with the claw of my wrench, exposing a nest of fiber optic cables that were already melting into a sticky, black sludge. The smell of burning plastic hit my throat, bitter and thick, making my eyes water as I reached past the primary fuses to find the manual emergency breaker for the lower defense GRID. My fingers brushed against the cold, uninsulated copper of the primary ground wire, and for a split second, a jolt of high-voltage current snapped up my arm, turning my vision wet, locking the muscles in my jaw until I forced my hand away with a ragged gasp. But in that fraction of a second of agonizing contact, I felt the truth through the pulse of the wire. The lower defense grid wasn't malfunctioning. It was actively hunting. The thud-thud-thud inside the ventilation shaft stopped, replaced by a wet, scraping sound that seemed to be moving directly toward the secondary intake vent behind the crowd of RTY-5 women. I stood up, my burnt hand throbbing in time with the emergency lights, my eyes scanning the dark, shadowed corners of the upper catwalks where the air was growing thick and stagnant. That was when I noticed Rin, the girl from the unlisted manifest, standing perfectly still right beneath the intake vent, her head tilted back at a strange, inquisitive angle as if she were listening to a song only she could hear. "Get away from the vent," I yelled, my voice breaking the fragile illusion of order Vance had just established as I lunged across the platform, my boots skidding on the damp metal. I didn't know what was down there in the dark, but the machine had told me it was fast, heavy, and completely stripped of its safety protocols by the lockdown code. Before my hand could even reach the fabric of Rin's oversized jumpsuit, the heavy steel slats of the ventilation cover exploded outward with a deafening, metallic crash that sent egg shards of iron raining down onto the screaming crowd. The jagged circle of the ventilation plate slammed into the steel deck with a deafening, hollow clang that sent a shockwave of absolute panic through the front row of women. Shards of sheared aluminum bolts whistled through the red-tinted air, one of them slicing a clean, bloody line across Vance's cheek before burying itself deeply into the reinforced console behind her. Before the echo of the impact could even clear the higher rafters of the atrium, a massive, multi-jointed silhouette dropped through the ruptured vent ceiling, landing heavily on all fours with a metallic, hydraulic hiss that sounded exactly like a predatory animal cornering its prey. It was an automated maintenance drone, specifically a heavy-duty Model 4G meant for deep-keel welding, but its civilian safety limiters had been brutally torn away, leaving its said twin pneumatic pistons pulsing with a violent, rhythmic energy. The machine didn't possess eyes, yet its sensory array swung instantly toward the largest cluster of screaming civilian interns, its heavy carbon steel pincers snapping together enough force to cleanly sever a human thigh. I didn't stop to calculate the structural risk or the political hierarchy of our makeshift survival unit. My legs simply took over, driving my heavy boots across the slick, wet metal of the command platform before the screaming crowd could stampede into each other. I tackled Rin directly at the waist, throwing her small, shockingly light frame away from the impact zone just as the rogue welder lunged forward, its pressurized primary arm drivy. And a brilliant, blinding blue arc torch into the exact square inch of iron where her boots had been standing a millisecond prior. The stench of instantly vaporized metal filled my lungs, hot and choking, as I rolled across the floor with Rin wrapped in my arms, her body remaining completely rigid, her wide, and blinking eyes staring directly over my shoulder at the threshing machine without a single hint of human terror. "Get back! All of you, clear the western corridor and get behind the heavy logistics containers now," Vance roared, her voice successfully breaking through the paralyzing shock of the room as she drew her heavy combat knife, her fingers trembling slightly, but her posture instantly aligning into a textbook defensive stance. She didn't possess a firearm, but she possessed the brutal, unforgiving training of an elite security officer, using her left hand to drag two hyperventilating research assistants toward the safety of the structural pillars while keeping her eyes fixed on the machine's irregular movements. "Ethan, the safety kill switch is supposed to be located on the primary thoracic casing, right under the auxiliary cooling fan. Can you reach it from the catwalk?" "The kill switch won't work, Vance. The entire logic board has been hardwired into a continuous industrial loop," I shouted back, scrambling to my feet while dragging Rin behind the safety of a heavy electrical transformer unit, my mind already tracing the invisible schematic of the rogue drone through the sound of its straining gears. My hyper-focused intuition was screaming at me. The specific frequency of the machine's electric motor wasn't a standard malfunction or an accidental short circuit caused by the low CK down code. Someone had manually stripped the optical sensors, bypassing the core programming to turn a simple maintenance tool into a blind, relentless exterminator that only recognized organic warmth as a target to be neutralized. If I couldn't cut the primary power flow directly from the battery housing located between its lower drive tracks, the 45 women trapped in this room were going to be systematically hunted down until the air ran out. Chloe appeared beside us out of the shadows, her medical kit already unzipped, her small hands moving with a swift, desperate efficiency as she pressed a sterile gauze pad against the bleeding laceration on Vance's cheek without even waiting for permission from the rigid commander. "The lower maintenance bays are completely flooded, Ethan. If that thing cracks the main coolant lines behind the wall, the entire sector will be exposed to toxic freon gas within 90 seconds, Chloe said, her voice remarkably steady despite the fact that her lower lip was shaking violently from pure adrenaline. "Tell us what to do to disable it. We can't keep 45 terrified people quiet in an open room for much longer. I need 3 seconds of absolute stillness from that machine, and I need someone to distract its thermal sensors from the left side," I muttered, my fingers tightly gripping the handle of my heavy plasma cutter, my mind adjusting the output nozzle to maximum voltage even though the battery indicator was already flashing an angry amber. I glanced down at Rin, who was still sitting perfectly still against the cold metal wall, her fingertips tracing the small, intricate weld lines on the floor plates as if she were reading Braille. "Vance, when I count to 3, I need you to throw the heavy emergency flashlight directly at the secondary exhaust port on its left flank. It operates on infrared tracking. The heat signature of the glass will force its logic array to recalculate its trajectory for exactly 2 frames. Vance didn't nod. She simply shifted her weight, her knuckles turning completely white around the hilt of her knife as her eyes locked onto the twitching, pneumatic arm of the "1," I whispered, the sound of my own heartbeat echoing like a bass drum against the hollow steel walls of the atrium. "2. The machine world, its high-frequency arc torch spitting a shower of white-hot sparks against the central pillar, the heat radiating across the room until the air felt heavy and thick. 3. The flashlight left Vance's hand like a bullet, striking the machine's exhaust port with a sharp, shattering crunch that instantly triggered its altered programming, forcing the heavy carbon steel chassis to violently pivot 40 degrees to the left in search of the sudden heat source. I lunged from behind the transformer, my boots catching the edge of the drainage grate as I threw my entire body weight onto the top of the threshing drum, my left hand wrapping round its oily hydraulic neck, while my right drove the plasma cutter straight into the unarmored seam of its primary battery housing. A blinding eruption of blue electricity surged outward, snapping through the handle of my tool and throwing a massive jolt of raw voltage directly through my forearms, the pain so intense that my vision instantly fragmented into jagged blocks of absolute darkness. I screamed through clenched teeth, refusing to let go of the shuddering machine as the smell of melting lithium and scorched insulation poured into my face, until finally, with a dying hiss of escaping pneumatic pressure, the heavy steel frame collapsed beneath me and became completely inert. I lay across the smoking chassis for a long, agonizing moment, my muscles spasming from the electrical backflow, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as the emergency red leg HTS of the atrium slowly stopped spinning. Vance was beside me instantly, her strong hands pulling me off the dangerous machinery, her eyes scanning my scorched palms with a rare flash of genuine concern before her professional mask slammed back down. "You're an idiot, Blake, but you're an idiot who knows how to kill a machine," she muttered, her voice rough as she helped me steady myself against the console. I didn't answer her. My eyes were locked onto the exposed interior of the destroyed drone's battery housing, where the melting wires were still sizzling against the frame. Inside the core of the standard military-grade maintenance unit, nestled right between the primary logic processors, was a small, crudely salvaged component that didn't belong to a NY Tech manifest on this ship. It was a human bone, a small, meticulously carved fragment of a finger joint, wrapped tightly in copper wiring and soldered directly into the main operational circuit board like a makeshift mystical capacitor. I thought the worst part of our isolation was the mechanical breakdown of the fortress. I was wrong. Looking at the ancient, carved bone controlling the modern military machine, I realized the entity that trapped us here wasn't playing by any rules of human engineering. Gee, the blood in my veins felt like it was freezing over, completely independent of the icy ocean air currently whistling through the breached ventilation shaft. I stared at the scorched battery housing of the dead drone, my mind refusing to accept the tactile reality of what my fingers were touching, the unmistakable, jagged texture of a man finger bone fused directly into the main silicon logic board. This wasn't an accidental short circuit, a manufacturing defect, or a standard software glitch caused by the sudden automated emergency lockdown. Someone had intentionally, meticulously harvested an organic component, wrapped it in crude copper threading, and soldered it into the high-voltage circuit to override the drone's hardwired safety protocols. The implications were dizzying. The security of this multi-billion-dollar floating fortress hadn't just been breached from the outside, it had been structurally sabotaged from within by someone who understood both advanced military robotics and the macabre mechanics of terror. Vance stepped up beside me, her heavy combat boots crunching on the loose aluminum rivets scattered across the deck plates, her sharp eyes instantly tracking the direction of my FRO's stare. She wiped a fresh smear of dark blood from her split cheek with the back of her tactical glove, her face tightening into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury as she saw the tiny, little fragment wired into the machine's smoking core. "What the hell am I looking at, Blake?" she hissed under her breath, her voice dropping into a low, threatening register so the 43 terrified civilians shivering behind the primary logistics containers wouldn't catch the sudden tremor in her tone. "Tell me that's a polymer component. Tell me it's a synthetic stabilizer from the engineering bay, because if you tell me what I think it is, I'm going to lock this entire room down myself." "It's a human distal phalanx, Vance, the tip of a pinky finger, to be exact," I replied, my voice flat, empty of emotion as my hyper-focused intuition mapped out the altered circuit. Right in my head, tracing the phantom current that had driven the machine to hunt. The marrow has been hollowed out to let a fiber optic cable pass through the center, acting as a biological resistor to bypass the optical recognition array. The machine didn't attack because its software corrupted. It attacked because this bone forced its internal clock to recognize every living body in this room as an unmapped obstruction. I reached down with my pliers, carefully snapping the copper wire to isolate the bone fragment before placing it into an empty component pouch on my belt, my movement steady. Why, despite the icy sweat dripping down the back of my neck? Behind us, The fragile illusion of order we had established was already beginning to fray at the edges like a rotting sail under storm pressure. Two of the senior research assistants were arguing loudly with Chloe, their voices rising in a shrill, panicked crescendo as they demanded to know why the emergency medkits didn't contain satellite phones or long-range distress beacons. Chloe handled them with the quiet, practiced patience of a triage nurse, her hands remaining completely steady as she applied antiseptic to a sobbing girl's scraped arm, though would see her gaze drifting toward me every few seconds, looking for a signal. She knew as well as I did that 45 people trapped in a sealed steel box would last less than 48 hours if the psychological panic turned into physical violence, and right now, the atmospheric pressure in the room was dropping faster than our water supply. I turned my back on the crowd, my eyes scanning the dark, shadowed perimeter of the command platform until they locked onto Rin, who hadn't moved an inch since the drone had collapsed. She remained curled against the cold iron bulkhead, her knees pulled tight against her oversized white jumpsuit, her long, dark hair falling forward to partially obscure a face. T was entirely devoid of sweat, tears, or adrenaline. While every other girl in the atrium was hyperventilating or clutching their neighbors for warmth, Rin was staring at the dark blood pooling around Vance's boots with a detached, clinical curiosity that made the hair on my arms stand up. I walked over to her, crouching down so my shadow blocked her view of the ruined maintenance drone, my wrench balanced loosely across my knees. You knew it was coming down that shaft before the bolts even sheared, didn't you? I asked quietly, my voice barely audible above the low, rhythmic thumping of the auxiliary ventilation fans. She didn't flinch or look up at me immediately. Instead, her fingers slowly stopped tracing the weld lines on the floor, her pale hand coming to rest precisely over a hidden structural seam in the titanium deck plating. When she finally raised her head, her striking, dark eyes looked right through me, completely bypassing the grease stains on my uniform and the burns on my palms to lock onto something far deeper. The metal sings when it's unhappy, Ethan, she whispered, her voice carrying a strange, melodic cadence that didn't sound like anyone who had passed through the standard naval my registration desks this morning. The bone makes it loud. It wanted to see if we were strong enough to turn the key. Before I could press her for an explanation or demand to know how she knew my name when my security badge was turned backward, a sharp, crystalline ping echoed through the western quadrant of the atrium. It was a tiny sound, insignificant compared to the roar of the previous explosion, but to my ears, it was the sound of a death sentence. I stood up instantly, my eyes darting toward the primary load-bearing pillar that anchored the upper catwalks to the fortress's outer hull. A hairline fracture, no wider than a piece of dental floss, had just zipped cleanly through the reinforced concrete casing, weeping a dark, greasy stream of pressurized hydraulic fluid onto the deck below. I didn't know it yet, but she had already decided that the machine wasn't our biggest problem. The very foundation of the Fauday was beginning to eat itself alive from the bottom up. The dark, viscous hydraulic fluid didn't splash. It leaked with a rhythmic, sickening hiss that ran down the gray concrete casing of the primary load-bearing pillar like an open wound. I didn't say a word to Vance, nor did I look back at the 43 shivering civilian interns who were currently drawing comfort from the silence that followed the drone's destruction. My hyper-focused intuition was already stripping away the metal walls of the atrium in my mind, calculating the exact tolerances of the remaining structural supports as the pressure from the flooded ballast tanks beneath us continued to climb. The hairline fracture was zipping upward at roughly 2 inches per minute, meaning the titanium steel composite of the outer hull was beginning to bow inward under the immense weight of the Pacific Ocean pressing against our locked cage. If that structural pillar sheared completely, the upper catwalks would collapse into the central floor, crushing our remaining supply crates and opening a direct path for the frozen seawater to swallow this entire sector whole before the emergency automated backup pumps could even register the breach. Ethan, your hands are shaking, and it's not from the electrical shock anymore, Chloe said quietly, her voice a low, soothing murmur that barely carried past the steady hum of the auxiliary transformer as she stepped into my blind spot. She didn't look at the cracked concrete. Instead, she reached out, her small, cool fingers wrapping firmly around my scorched wrist to gently pull my hand away from the sharp edge of the melting junction terminal before I could inadvertently short out the remaining emergency lights. Her touch was remarkably grounded, smelling faintly of clean antiseptic and lavender soap, a stark contrast to the thick, metallic stench of ozone and burnt blood that currently led the stagnant air of the atrium. You're looking at the support beam the same way you looked at the maintenance drone right before it tore through the ceiling. Tell me what we're actually dealing with before someone else notices the fluid on the deck and starts a stampede toward the sealed blast doors. The structural foundation of this sector is suffering from localized stress fatigue, Chloe. But it's not being caused by the lockdown code, I murmured, keeping my voice flat and completely devoid of the icy panic that was trying to lock up my jaw muscles as I leaned closer to her, my shoulder brushing against hers in the cramped space between the machinery. The automated ballast valves aren't just stuck. They've been intentionally reprogrammed to pump seawater into the upper stabilization tanks while keeping the lower drainage lines completely sealed. Someone is trying to maximize the physical weight on this specific room to force a catastrophic hull collapse from the inside out, and they used the emergency protocol as a story to make sure everyone was gathered in one place when it happened. I pulled a small, brass diagnostic gauge from my tool belt, threading it manually into a secondary pressure line near the base of the pillar to confirm the reading. The needle instantly slammed into the crimson warning zone, vibrating with a frantic, high-frequency rattle that sounded like a countdown. Behind us, Rin was still sitting with her back pressed firmly against the cold iron bulkhead, her long, dark hair draped over her knees like a protective shroud as she watched the tiny droplets of hydraulic fluid pool on the steel deck plates. She didn't look afraid, nor did she join the small group of researchers who were currently huddling around Vance to beg for information about the fortress's long-range communicatio and arrays. Instead, her eyes remained fixed on my hands, a strange, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "The pressure is a heavy blanket, Ethan," she murmured, her melodic voice cutting through the low rumble of the machinery with an eerie, rhythmic clarity that seemed to bypass the chaotic background noise entirely. "The fortress wants to sleep at the bottom of the shelf, but the little key you found in the machine is still humming in your pocket." I reached into my utility pouch, my burnt fingers instantly brushing against the cold, jagged surface of the carved finger bone I had cut from the drone's battery housing just minutes before. Through the thick leather of my glove, I could feel a faint, rhythmic vibration pulsing inside the biological fragment, a high-frequency micro-signal that didn't match any military radio frequency or emergency distress beacon I had ever encountered during my years on the maintenance crew. It was a live signal, broadcasting a continuous stream of automated data to an unmapped receiver located directly underneath the flooded floor plates of the western corridor. If I could follow that signal to its source before the structural fracture sheared the primary load-bearing pillar, I might be able to manually trip the drainage overrides and save 45 people from becoming a permanent part of the ocean floor. "Vance, I need you to maintain the perimeter around the central logistics containers and keep the crowd from moving toward the western sector, no matter what kind of noises come of the floor," I commanded, stepping back into the crimson light of the command platform as I gripped my heavy plasma cutter with both hands. Vance turned around instantly, her sharp jaw locked in a hard expression of military defiance, though the fresh gauze pad Chloe had applied to her bleeding cheek was already beginning to bloom with a dark, circular stain. "I'm taking Chloe with me to verify the secondary intake valves near the keel. If we don't clear the air mixture within 20 minutes, the carbon dioxide levels in this room will make it impossible for anyone to stand up straight." Vance glared at me, her fingers resting heavily on the hilt of her tactical knife as her eyes darted from my face to the weeping fracture on the concrete pillar behind me. She was smart enough to recognize that I was lying to the group, but she was also disciplined enough to understand that revealing the structural failure right now would turn the atrium into a slaughterhouse of panicked civilians. "You have 15 minutes, Tech, and if you aren't back with oxygen by then, I'm using the manual emergency charges to blow the primary blast doors on Sector 3, hull integrity BD. And she hissed, her voice dropping into a dangerous whisper that left no room for negotiation as she turned her back to us to face the anxious crowd once more. I motioned for Chloe to follow me, our boots making a soft, squelching sound as we stepped over the dark pool of hydraulic fluid and slipped into the narrow, unlit access tunnel that led toward the western drainage arrays. The air inside the crawlspace was cold, thick with the scent of stagnant seawater and old grease, the ceiling so low that we were forced to move in a hunched, unnatural posture. T brought our bodies into constant, jarring contact in the dark. I could hear Chloe's shallow, rapid breathing right behind my shoulder, her hand occasionally reaching out to grip the back of my tool belt for balance whenever the deck played shoe. Dee dared from the rising pressure below. I didn't know it yet, but she had already decided that whatever we found at the end of this tunnel would determine whether she survived the night or died in the dark with her medic. Our kit unopened. At the end of the corridor, where the secondary drainage pipes were supposed to connect to the main ocean valves, the tunnel opened up into a small, cylindrical junction chamber. It wasn't marked on any standard maintenance blueprint of the fortress. In the center of the room, bolted directly into the titanium frame of the outer hull, was a massive, ancient-looking pneumatic bulkhead that was completely covered in a thick, green layer of marine growth and calcified barnacles. The modern military-grade rivets around the rim had been crudely cut away with an industrial torch, replaced by a series of heavy, hand-forged iron clamps that were pulsing with a faint, rhythmic bioluminescent light. I held my diagnostic pad up to the wet metal, my heart stopping as the screen instantly flared with a massive, unauthorized data stream that wasn't coming from inside the ship, but from somewhere deep in the black water outside. The ancient iron clamps holding the unmapped bulkhead to the modern titanium hull didn't just vibrate. They pulsed with a sluggish, sickening warmth that felt entirely too much like a failing cardiovascular system. Thick, calcified barnacles and stringy black marine moss swept a steady stream of briny, foul-smelling water down the curved metal walls of the chamber, the stench of rotting kelp and ancient rust hitting the back of my throat like an physical blow. My wrist terminal flared a violent, erratic orange, the digital screen fracturing into chaotic static as it attempted to parse the massive, unauthorized data stream bleeding direct through the corrupted weld lines from the black ocean outside. The architecture here was completely wrong, a chaotic, violent intersection where multi-billion-dollar naval engineering had been brutally hollowed out and welded onto something archaic, heavy, and deeply wrong. My hyper-focused intuition was screaming at me, tracing the phantom electrical current running from the carved finger bone in my utility pouch straight into the pulsing biolumines, sent veins of the iron frame, proving that the lockdown above wasn't an emergency protocol at all, but a systemic awakening. Ethan, the air down here isn't just stagnant. The ambient temperature is climbing by 2 degrees every 60 seconds because the auxiliary cooling lines have been completely revered. Said, Chloe whispered, her voice a tight, disciplined murmur as she stepped closer to my shoulder, her fingers gripping the strap of her medical kit so tightly her knuckles looked like polished ivory. She didn't look at the pulsing green light. Instead, she reached out, her small, cool palm pressing firmly against the side of my neck to check my heart rate, her professional clinical detachment the only thing keeping her from collapsing into the damp mold covering the deck plates. Her breathing was shallow, but remarkably controlled, the subtle scent of her antiseptic soap momentarily cutting through the oppressive, aquatic stench of the junction chamber as he leaned her forehead against my arm to steady her balance against the shuddering floor. 45 people are sitting directly above our heads waiting for oxygen, but if these clamps give way under the current pressure differential, the displacement will flatten this entire subdeck before they even have time to realize the hull has been breached. The ballast system isn't clogged. Chloe, it's being used as an automated siphon to pull a specific frequency from the deep water into the fortress's central processing core. I muttered, my voice flat and clipped as I manually adjusted the power regulators on my heavy plasma cutter, my mind tracing the invisible blueprints of the ship to find a manual bypass that didn't exist on any naval manifest. I reached out, my thick leather glove brushing against one of the hand-forged iron clamps, and an immediate, low-frequency vibration rattled through my teeth, presenting a mental image of a massive, dark silhouette shifting in the freezing trenches miles beneath our floating cage. The machine logic of the fortress had been entirely subordinated to this archaic mechanism. Someone had deliberately sacrificed the structural integrity of Sector 4 to ensure that whatever was broadcasting from the Black Pacific had a direct, unshielded port into the ship's primary nervous system. I took a short step back, my boots splashing through a fresh puddle of warm, greasy water that was beginning to well up from the structural seams near my feet, realizing that the fracture in the atrium above was just the surface symptom of a much deeper anatomical rejection. Before I could drive the plasma cutter into the primary copper grounding wire to force a localized system freeze, a soft, rhythmic scratching sound echoed from the narrow access to NL behind us, instantly freezing the air in my lungs. Rin stepped out of the shadows of the crawlspace, her oversized white jumpsuit completely pristine despite the greasy soot lining the tunnel walls, her long, dark hair swaying HTLY in the unnatural thermal draft rising from the floor. She didn't look at the pulsing bulkhead with surprise or terror. Instead, she walked straight toward the ancient iron frame, her pale fingers extending to trace the calcified ridge of the marine growth with a gentle, almost affectionate familiarity that made my hand instinctively drop toward the heavy handle of my wrench. "The door is very hungry tonight, Ethan," she said, her melodic voice carrying that same rhythmic, unbothered cadence that felt entirely detached from the mortal stakes of 45 people suffocating in a steel box. "The bone you took from the little metal worker was just the first whisper. The things outside have been waiting for the iron to get warm enough to slide the bolt. Rin, if you know who altered these relays or how this manifest was falsified, you need to speak clearly right now, before I use this cutter to burn through the core logic board," I said, my voice dropping into a dangerous, unyielding whisper as I stepped between her and Chloe, my posture hardening into a defensive block that left no room for her cryptic game. I could feel Chloe's hand instantly gripping the back of my utility belt, her fingers trembling slightly, but her weight shifting perfectly with mine, anchoring us together in the ramped, red-tinted twilight of the failing junction chamber. Rin didn't flinch at my tone, she merely tilted her head to the side, her striking, completely vacant eyes locking onto the small component pouch on my belt where the carved finger bone was still vibrating against my hip. "You can't burn the song out of the wire, technician," she whispered, her fingers suddenly stopping over a large, brass valve assembly that wasn't connected to any fluid line on ship. "It's already inside the atrium. Vance is currently looking at the second bone, but she doesn't have your hands to cut it away." A sudden, sharp crack like a rifle shot echoed through the titanium bulkheads above our heads, followed immediately by the distant, muffled screaming of 43 terrified women, echoing down the narrow ventilation shafts of the western corridor. The primary load-bearing pillar in the atrium had just suffered another structural failure, and the sudden shift in kinetic weight threw the junction chamber 40 degrees to the left, sending a wave of greasy, warm seawater crashing over our boots. I lunged forward to catch Chloe as her feet slipped on the slick iron deck, wrapping my burnt arm tightly around her waist to anchor her against the central transformer unit while my other hand drove the claw of my wrench into a structural seam to keep us from sliding into the pulsing bulkhead. I thought the worst part of the lockdown was the structural collapse of the Faudae. I was wrong. Looking at the ancient iron clamps on the bulkhead suddenly beginning to unscrew themselves against the pressure of the ocean, I realized the real nightmare wasn't trying to keep us and it was actively unlocking the gate from the outside. The forged iron clamps didn't just slip, they sheared with a succession of violent, high-pitched snaps that sounded like structural rivets popping under artillery fire. A jet of freezing, black Pacific seawater instantly geysered through the newly opened seam of the unmapped bulkhead, striking the steel deck with immense hydraulic force and kicking up a blinding, icy mist that smelled heavily of deep ocean decay and dead kelp. The sudden change in cabin pressure slammed into my eardrums like a physical blow, turning the digital display of my wrist terminal into a completely unreadable smear of strobing rain static. My hyper-focused intuition was firing on all cylinders now, translating the violent vibration of the iron plates into a precise volumetric map of the subdeck. The drainage corridor behind us was already taking on water at a rate of roughly 40 gallons per second, meaning this junction chamber would be entirely submerged in less than 4 minutes. I didn't waste breath explaining the physics of a pneumatic pressure lock to Chloe. I simply grabbed the heavy handle of her medical kit with one hand while my burnt right arm locked securely around her waist, dragging her bodily backward away from the freezing torrent before the sheer velocity of the water column could sweep her off her feet. The structural seals on the primary intake pipeline are buckling from the counterpressure, Ethan, which means the water level in the main atrium above is about to rise through floor vents. Chloe screamed over the deafening roar of the spraying ocean, her small fingers digging desperately into the canvas of my utility vest for leverage as her boots lost traction on the flooded, grease-slicked iron deck. Even with her vision partially obscured by the briny mist and her lower jaw shaking violently from the sudden drop in ambient temperature, her survival instincts remained incredible. Why disciplined? Her free hand instantly reaching into her pocket to secure a dry roll of surgical pressure tape before her entire kit was ruined by the salt water. Her wet hair clung to her cheeks in dark, tangled streaks, and as the freezing tide rapidly swirled up past our ankles, the subtle, clean scent of her antiseptic soap was completal. Why swallowed by the metallic stench of drowning machinery and old diesel fuel? If we don't clear this access shaft before the secondary pneumatic gates drop, we're going to be drowned like rats in a ballast tank before Vance can even set her emergency demolly ton charges. The gates aren't dropping by accident. Chloe, the core system, is actively trying to quarantine this chamber to protect the central processing unit from the external data feed. I held back, my voice flat and clipped as I slammed the claw of my heavy wrench against the manual release valve of the secondary drainage pipe, trying to force a counterflow that might stall the rising water long enough for us to scramble back into the access tunnel. Through the thick leather of my work glove, the metal felt incredibly hot to the touch despite the freezing seawater swirling around my knees, proving that the anomalous biosignal from the carved finger bone in my pouch was still dumping raw voltage directly into the ship's local wiring. I glanced over my shoulder and saw Rin standing completely frozen near the ruptured edge of the bulkhead, the rising black tide already swirling around her mid-thigh, yet her white jumpsuit remained unmarred by the greasy scum coating the walls. Her pale arms were extended loosely at her sides, her fingertips gently brushing the surface of the freezing water with a bizarre, rhythmic serenity that looked less like a trap, civilian and more like a scientist observing a successful chemical reaction. "The iron has stopped resisting the weight," Ethan, Rin murmured, her low, melodic voice somehow slicing through the industrial din of the spraying geyser with a terrifying, crystal clear resonance that didn't belong in a drowning subdeck. She didn't look at the jet of water roaring inches from her face. Her vacant, unblinking eyes were locked entirely onto the small component pouch on my belt, her lips curved into T. That same knowing, glassy smile that made my blood run colder than the Pacific. The first bone opened the eyes of the machine, but the second one is currently rewriting the captain's log upstairs. If you try to seal this valve now, the fortress will simply ooze a different room to sacrifice. I ignored her warning, driving the full weight of my shoulder into the frozen handle of the manual override bypass until the internal brass gears sheared with a sickening, grinding crunch that sent a sharp jolt of agony straight through my healing palms. The heavy drainage valve finally gave way, turning 3 full rotations before locking into place, and with a deep, subterranean groan, the rushing column of water spraying from ancient bulkhead began to slowly slacken into a greasy, high-pressure trickle. "Chloe, move! Get into the access tunnel and climb the vertical ladder toward Sector 4 before the secondary pressure differential locks the hatch from the upper side," I barked, grabbing Rin by the collar of her jumpsuit with my slick glove and shoving her firmly toward the narrow, crawlspace entrance where Chloe was already waiting, her hand steady as she helped guide unbothered girl into the dark, rusted iron pipe. Chloe scrambled into the tunnel first, her wet medical kit banging heavily against the structural ribs of the frame as she climbed with a desperate, uncoordinated speed that was fueled entirely by pure survival adrenaline. I lunged into the opening right behind Rin, my heavy boots skidding violently on the wet iron lip of the hatchway, as a sudden, massive structural tremor shook the entire foundation of the Faudae, tilting the corridor an additional 10 degrees to the west. Somewhere in the dark belly of the ship, a primary circuit breaker exploded with a dull, muffled boom that instantly killed the remaining orange emergency lights in the crawlspace, plunging us into an absolute, suffocating darkness that smelled of fried copper and wet soot. I reached out in the blackness, my fingers instantly finding the cold, wet rungs of the vertical ladder, but before my boots could even clear the flooded floor plates of the junkie, on chamber below, a loud, metallic clanging sound echoed directly above our heads. The automated internal security grid had just registered the sudden drop in system voltage, and with a hiss of pressurized pneumatic air, the heavy iron isolation hatch at the top of the ladder slammed shut with absolute finality. I was trapped in the dark vertical shaft between the rising tide and a locked door, and I didn't know it yet, but she had already realized that my wrench wasn't going to be enough to open the way back to the living. The absolute darkness of the vertical air shaft pressed against my chest like a physical weight, thick with the choking stench of oxidized copper and scorched insulation. Below my dangling boots, the black seawater sloshed and gurgled against the cold iron walls of the junction chamber, the water level rising with a steady, relentless hiss that told me the drainage bypass I had manually forced was already failing under the pressure of the Pacific. I squeezed the rungs of the steel ladder until the raw, blistered skin on my palms burned with a fresh wave of agony, my breath coming in short, controlled gasps as my hyper-focused de-intuition mapped out the tight geometry of the shaft. Rin was a static warmth right above my shoulder, her breath incredibly slow and even, while Chloe's frantic, ragged breathing echoed from the very top of the ladder where her small hands were currently hammering uselessly against the reinforced seal of the locked isolation hatch. The automated security system had completely marooned us in this vertical coffin to prevent the external biosignal from corrupting the upper decks, and with the primary power grid dead, the pneumatic locking pins were permanently extended by deadweight gravity. Ethan, the seal won't budge an inch, and the manual bypass lever up here has been completely sheared off from the outside frame. Chloe cried down into the darkness, her voice seeking with the sharp, raw edge of mounting panic as she slammed her heavy medical kit against the reinforced titanium plate. I could hear the desperate scraping of her fingernails against the frozen rivets, her wet boot slipping violently on the narrow metal rungs as she struggled to maintain her footing above the rising tide. Despite the terrifying finality of the locked hatch, she didn't drop her kit or stop looking for a structural flaw in the seal, her stubborn survival instinct anchoring her to that ladder even as the freezing air current from below began to thin out. The subtle, clean scent of her lavender soap had long since vanished, replaced entirely by the sharp, metallic tang of my own blood and the stagnant, briny mist rising from the block CK water that was already swirling around the heels of my boots. Save your breath and stop hitting the frame, Chloe. That hatch is designed to withstand a localized hull breach, so mechanical force isn't going to slide those locking pins back. NTO the housing, I called up calmly, my voice flat, dry, and entirely stripped of the adrenaline that was trying to force my heart through my ribs. I reached out in the pitch blackness, my wet fingers tracing the cold, uninsulated wiring harness that ran along the spine of the ladder until I found the specific, vibrating pulse of the secondary security relay. My hidden talent wasn't a magic trick. It was just a highly tuned spatial understanding of mechanical systems, a mental blueprint that allowed me to feel the dying current of the fortress through the metal veins of the shaft. The carved finger bone in my utility pouch was still pulsing with that strange, high-frequency microsignal, its rhythmic vibration echoing perfectly through the copper wire I was holding, proving that the anomalous biosignal was the very thing keeping the isolation hatch permanently sealed. Directly above me, Rin let out a soft, rhythmic chuckle that sounded entirely too light and melodic for a dark shaft that was rapidly filling with freezing seawater. Her small hand reached down, her cool, dry fingertips gently brushing against the back of my neck with a strange, deliberate pressure that sent a sharp jolt of static electricity straight down my spine. The captain is dead, Ethan, but the voice in the wire is still looking for a mouth to speak through, she whispered into the dark, her lips so close to my ear that I could feel faint, unnaturally cold draft of her breath against my skin. The security gate isn't keeping you away from the 45 girls upstairs. It's keeping the things upstairs from sliding down the ladder to join us in the water. Rin, if you don't take your hand off my neck, I'm going to drop your wrench into the ballast tanks and let you find your own way out of this pipe, I muttered, my voice dropping. NTO a low, sarcastic grunt as I pulled a small, heavy pair of wire cutters from my belt and positioned them blindly over the main security relay wire. I didn't know what kind of game she was playing or how her manifest had been falsified, but my intuition told me that cutting the primary ground wire would momentarily trick the low Jake bored into thinking the entire sector had been completely vaporized. I squeezed the handles of the cutters with both hands, ignoring the sharp, tearing pain in my burnt palms as the hardened steel blades slowly bit through the thick rubber insulatio. A brilliant, blinding blue spark exploded in the darkness of the shaft, illuminating Chloe's pale, terrified face above me and Rin's wide, glassy smile before the current snaps to rough my forearms and threw me into a violent fit of coughing. The heavy pneumatic locking pins inside the isolation hatch instantly retracted with a loud, metallic clunk thud, and the heavy titanium plate swung upward by 2 inches, allowing a thin, beautiful sliver of crimson emergency light from Sector 4 to cut through the suffocating darkness. It's open! Ethan, the seal's released. Chloe gasped, her hands immediately shoving the heavy hatch wide open as she scrambled up onto the dry steel deck of the upper corridor, her wet boots leaving a trail of dark, greasy footprints behind her. She turned around instantly, leaning deep into the open shaft to grab Rin by the shoulders of her jumpsuit, dragging her out of the dark pipe with a fierce, adrenaline-fueled strength. GTH before reaching down to offer her small, trembling hand to me. I grabbed her wrist, the cold friction of our skin grounding me as I hauled my heavy boots out of the rising water and tumbled onto the solid deck of the corridor, my chest heaving, as I sucked in the stale, copper-tinted air of the upper level. We lay on the cold iron plates for a single, quiet second, our wet clothes sticking to the metal as the heavy isolation hatch automatically slammed shut behind us, permanently sealing the drowning subdeck away from the living. But before Chloe could even unzip her medical kit to inspect the fresh electrical burns on my forearms, a sharp, deafening burst of static screeching erupted from the digital diagnostic terminal strapped to my left wrist. The small screen didn't display the standard system logs or the crimson lockdown warnings. Instead, the entire interface was completely overridden by a live audio transmission emanating from the central atrium where Vance and the other 43 girls were supposed to be barricaded. The sound that poured from the small speaker wasn't the rhythmic thumping of the machinery or the low murmur of a disciplined military perimeter. It was a chaotic, horrifying symphony of twisting metal, shattering glass, and the high-pitched, unbridled screaming of dozens of women running for their lives. Above the terrifying din of the stampede, the sharp, authoritative voice of Vance cut through the static, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps as the distinct, rhythmic thud-thud of a heavy automated defense unit echoed directly behind her. Blake, if you can hear this, do not come back to the central atrium. The lower security grid didn't just malfunction, something else crawled out of the secondary ventilation shaft, and it's already inside the walls. It's changing them, Ethan. It's changing. Her voice was abruptly cut short by a wet, sickening crunch of breaking bone, followed immediately by a final, blood-curdling scream that froze the air in my lungs. Before the terminal went completely dead, I stared at the blank, smoking screen of my wrist pad, my body paralyzed by the sudden, absolute silence of the corridor, realizing that the real slaughter hadn't happened in the dark waters below, but in the very sanctuary we had just fought to protect.